My son said I was too poor to sit at his wedding. So I stayed silent. Before we begin, drop a comment below with your country and what time it is right now where you're watching. Whether it's sunrise in Nairobi, midnight in New York, afternoon in Canada, or evening in France, I want to know. Don't just sit back. Tell me where in the world you are. Now let's dive into the story. The sky over Hawthorne Estate was the soft gold of late September, the kind of light that made even strangers look beautiful. White roses climbed the iron arch. A string quartet tuned beneath the willow. And Odessa Rourke, 63 years old, stood at the edge of it all in a navy blue dress she had sewn by hand over 11 nights, the hem pressed so many times the fabric had gone thin as a whisper. She had ironed that dress until her wrist ached. She had polished her one pair of good shoes with a dish towel. She had practiced in the mirror above her sink, the way she would smile when she met her son's new family. Warm but not too eager. Proud but not proud enough to embarrass anyone. She had waited 31 years to watch her boy get married. She had imagined this day so many times it felt like a memory before it ever happened. Callum came across the lawn quickly, the way a man walks when he hopes no one will notice where he's going. He wore a charcoal suit that cost more than his mother's rent. His shoes did not make a sound on the grass. "Mom," he said, and he did not look at her when he said it. He looked at the guests behind him. The Whitfields, the senators' wives, the men who summered in places Odessa had only cleaned. "There's been a change with the seating." He lowered his voice until it was almost tender, and that was the cruelest part. "Sloane's family. They've set the tables a certain way. It's a certain kind of crowd. I think you'd be more comfortable near the back. By the caterers. Nobody's going to bother you there." He did not say the rest of it. He did not have to. Too poor. Too plain. Too much of where he came from. "Please don't make this hard," he said. And then he was gone, back into the gold light, laughing at something a stranger said. Odessa did not make it hard. That was the thing people would remember later, the ones who came to know the story. She did not raise her voice, did not clutch his sleeve, did not let a single tear fall where anyone could photograph it. She simply nodded once, the way she had nodded at 1,000 small cruelties across a lifetime of being poor in a country that pretends it does not notice such things. A young man in a catering vest, no older than 20, saw her standing alone and understood before she said a word. Quietly, kindly. He carried a metal folding chair to a spot behind the dessert table, half hidden by a linen curtain, and he set it down and said, "Ma'am, you can see everything from here." He did not know he was apologizing for a whole family. Odessa touched his arm and told him he was a good boy. Then she sat, and she folded her hands in her lap, and she waited for her son to be married. From the folding chair she could see the arch, the willow, the sea of pale suits and jeweled ears. She could smell the roses and beneath them, the sharp green smell of cut grass. In her handbag, the same brown handbag she had carried to church for 19 years, there was a photograph, soft as cloth from handling. In it, a much younger Odessa held a laughing baby against a peeling kitchen wall, and behind them, out of focus, stood a tall man with a crooked smile. She did not take the photograph out. She only pressed her hand against the bag, the way you press a hand to a wound, and she thought about all the things a mother carries that no one ever sees. The quartet began to play. Guests found their seats, their proper seats, at their proper tables, with their names in gold on little cards. And nobody in all that gold light thought to wonder who the woman behind the dessert table was, or why she alone had no name card at all. But one man wondered. He was old, older than Odessa by 20 years at least, and he sat at the head table, in the seat of honor the Whitfields had begged him to take, because his name on a guest list was worth more to them than money. He had thin white hair and hands that shook slightly around his glass, and he had been watching the woman behind the dessert table for a long time now. He had watched a rich young architect walk to her, whisper something and walk away. He had watched a caterer bring her a folding chair. And slowly, as if the whole gold afternoon had gone quiet inside his chest, the old man set down his glass. His face had changed. It had gone pale, then hard the way stone goes hard. Because he knew that woman. He had known her for 11 years, though not one soul at that wedding would have believed how. And Silas Crane, the most respected man in that entire garden, pushed back his chair and rose to his feet. To understand why a mother would sit behind a dessert table and say nothing, you have to go back 30 years, to a town called Millhaven, Ohio, where the river ran the color of weak coffee and the mills had already begun to close. Odessa was 32 the morning the foreman knocked on her door. She was standing at the stove in a yellow robe, stirring oatmeal for a 3-year-old boy who banged his spoon and called it a drum. Emmett had left for the job site an hour before, kissing her neck, promising to bring home peaches. He never came home. A scaffold had given way on the 4th floor of a building he would never see finished. The foreman turned his hard hat in his hands and could not look at her, and behind Odessa the oatmeal began to burn, and the little boy kept drumming, not yet knowing that the whole shape of his life had just been decided in a single ordinary second on an ordinary Tuesday. Odessa did not scream. She turned off the stove. Grief, she has often said, taught her silence long before pride ever did. They lived above Duval's laundromat on Sycamore Street, in 2 rooms that smelled always of fabric softener and warm lint rising through the floorboards. Odessa had one skill in the world, and it was her hands. She could take a wedding gown apart and rebuild it to fit a different woman entirely. She could turn a dead man's Sunday suit into a winter coat for a growing boy. So she hung a small sign in the laundromat window, "Rourke Alterations, nothing too small," and she sewed. She sewed through the afternoons and long into the nights, the needle rising and falling in the lamplight while Callum slept in the next room. Her fingers grew calloused, her eyes grew tired. Some months she chose between the electric bill and shoes, and she always chose shoes, because a boy who wears shoes with holes learns to look down, and Odessa was determined that her son would grow up looking the world straight in the eye. "You come from good people," she told him. "Never let anyone make you feel small." On the top shelf of her closet, behind the winter blankets, Odessa kept a shoebox. It had once held Emmett's work boots, and it still smelled faintly of leather and sawdust, and inside it she kept the whole ledger of their small life. There were receipts, folded into careful squares, proof of every payment she had ever managed to make on time. There was a lock of Callum's baby hair tied with red thread. There was the crayon drawing he had made at 6, of a tall building with too many windows, and beneath it in shaky letters, "My dad built this," which was not true, but which she had never had the heart to correct. And there was one more thing in that box, though it would be years before it mattered. A single sheet of expensive letterhead, folded 3 times, that Odessa took out only when the fear of the future grew too large to carry alone. She would read it and fold it back and put it away. That box was the truest history of the Rourke family. And her son would not open it until the day it broke his heart. The boy grew, and the boy was gifted. Not gifted the way mothers imagine their children are gifted, but truly, unmistakably so. Callum saw buildings the way other children saw cartoons. He drew them on the backs of overdue bills, on napkins, on the fogged glass of the laundromat window. Cathedrals, towers, bridges that leapt across rivers that did not exist in Millhaven. When he was 11, his teacher, Mrs. Ferris, walked all the way to Sycamore Street to tell Odessa that her son had a mind that came along once in a generation, and that it would be a sin to waste it. Odessa listened at her door with a needle still in her hand, and something fierce and frightened woke up inside her. She understood standing there that talent was not enough. Talent needed schools, and schools needed money. And money was the one thing she had spent her whole life not having. That night she did not sleep. She sat at her machine, not sewing, only looking at the drawing of the too many windowed building, and she made herself a promise she did not yet know how she would keep. So when Callum turned 15 and began to speak of colleges the way other boys spoke of impossible dreams, Odessa did the arithmetic of her life and found it came up short by a fortune. The sewing was not enough. It had never been enough. It had only ever been almost enough, which is the most exhausting amount of money there is. She needed more, and there was only one kind of work in Millhaven that a woman with tired hands and no diploma could get at night, after the mending was done. Work that no one would see, that her son would never have to know about, that would let him keep believing his mother was only a seamstress and not a woman on her knees on cold marble floors after midnight. And so Odessa Rourke put on a second uniform. She told her son she was joining a church group that met in the evenings. She kissed his forehead, and she walked out into the dark, and she went to clean the offices of the finest architecture firm in the state, a firm called Crane and Vale. My child. A mother will wear two faces so her son can grow up believing in only one. That is not a lie. It is love with its sleeves rolled up. Crane and Vale occupied the top 4 floors of the tallest building in the city, an hour's bus ride from Millhaven. Odessa reported at 9 each night, after the architects had gone home to their families, and she let herself into a world she could scarcely believe was real. The floors were pale marble that held the cold like a held breath. The walls were glass. Everywhere there were models of buildings, tiny perfect cities under museum lights, towers of balsa wood and clear plastic no taller than her arm. She dusted them with the tenderness of a woman handling other people's dreams. She emptied the wastebaskets of men who earned in a week what she earned in a year, and she never once let bitterness in, because bitterness was a luxury and she could not afford it. She worked quietly, invisibly, the way the truly poor learn to move through the world of the rich, present but unseen, a shadow with a mop. For 3 years, not a single architect at that firm knew her name. And that was exactly how Odessa wanted it. Then came the January night the babysitter did not show, and Odessa, out of choices, brought 16-year-old Callum with her. "Sit in the lobby," she told him. "Do your homework. Touch nothing." But a boy who dreams in buildings cannot sit still inside the most beautiful building he has ever entered. While his mother scrubbed a break room on the 30th floor, Callum wandered. He found the model room, that glowing gallery of little cities, and he stood among them with his heart pounding, and then he did what he had done his whole life. He took out his pencil. There was a drafting table with clean white paper, and Callum sat down at it as if he belonged there, and he began to draw a tower that rose in a slow twist, like water turning, like something alive. He drew for an hour and lost all track of time. When his mother finally found him, she nearly wept with fear that they'd be caught, accused of stealing, thrown out into the snow. She hurried him home. But in her rush, they left the drawing behind on the table, in a firm full of the finest architects in the state. Silas Crane found it the next morning. He was 65 then, the founder, a man who had built airports and museums on 3 continents, and who had grown quietly certain that he had already met every talented young person he would ever meet. He came in early before the others, coffee in hand, and he saw the drawing on the drafting table. The twisting tower, drawn in cheap pencil on the firm's good paper by a hand he did not recognize. He stood over it for a long time. Then he called in his partners, and they stood over it too. And the room went silent in the particular way rooms go silent when serious people are looking at something rare. That evening, Silas Crane did something he had not done in 20 years. He stayed late. He waited by the elevators until 9, until a tired woman in a gray uniform stepped out pulling a cleaning cart, and he said, "Ma'am, I found a drawing this morning. On the 30th floor." Odessa's face went white. She began to apologize. And Silas Crane raised one shaking hand and said, "No, I want to know who made it." She told him the truth, because she was too frightened to invent a lie. "My son, Justine, he waits for me at night. He didn't mean any harm." And Silas Crane, who had spent his life learning to read the true shape of things, looked at this proud, trembling woman and understood in an instant the whole architecture of her sacrifice. He offered, right there by the elevators, to change her boy's life. The firm ran a foundation. There were scholarships, internships, a path from Millhaven to the wider world. He would open every door. But Odessa did not fall to her knees in gratitude the way he expected. Instead, she asked him for something, and it stunned him more than the drawing had. "He can never know it was me," she said. "He can never know I cleaned these floors. Let him think he earned it himself. Every bit of it. A boy who believes he owes his whole life to his mother's knees will spend that life ashamed. I would rather he be proud and forget me than grateful and small." Silas Crane wrote her a letter promising his silence. She kept it in a shoebox for 15 years. So it was done in the way Odessa wanted it done. Callum won the Crane Foundation scholarship on the strength of his portfolio, and he believed that with his whole heart, because his mother had made sure he would. He went off to study architecture 2 states away, the first Rourke ever to see the inside of a university. And Odessa kept cleaning. She cleaned to pay for his books, his bus tickets home, the good suit he wore to his first interview. The interview, as it happened, at Crane and Vale, where old Silas hired him and never once let his eyes betray that he had known the boy's mother for years, on her knees after midnight. Callum climbed. He became precisely the confident, self-made young man Odessa had prayed he would be. He learned to walk into any room as though he owned it. He learned, without ever meaning to, that he had come from nothing and made himself into something. And that, my child, that lie she gave him like a gift, was the seed that would one day grow into a folding chair behind a dessert table. Never underestimate what a quiet woman is carrying. The ones who ask for nothing have usually given the most. The years went by the way years do, quietly and then all at once. Callum rose at Crane and Vale, from intern to associate to the shortlist for junior partner. He bought a glass-walled condo overlooking the same river he had once drawn as a boy, though he never seemed to notice the connection. He wore good watches. He learned the names of wines. He came home to Millhaven less and less, first every month, then every season, then only at Christmas, when he would sit in his mother's 2 small rooms and glance, without meaning to, at the peeling paint and the ancient sewing machine, and something would tighten in his face that Odessa pretended not to see. She was proud of him. She told everyone at church about her son the architect. She never asked him for $1, never mentioned the years of marble floors, never let him carry the weight of what she had done. She only wanted him happy, and he seemed happy, and if he was slowly becoming a man faintly embarrassed by the place he came from, well, Odessa had built that pride with her own hands, and she would not now complain about the shape it had taken. He met Sloane Whitfield at a firm gala, beneath chandeliers the size of small cars. She was clever and lovely and laughed at his jokes, and she came from the kind of family Callum had spent his whole life circling from a distance. The Whitfields owned things, a development company, a stretch of the good hills outside the city, a name that opened doors before you finished saying it. To be loved by a Whitfield was, to a boy who had grown up above a laundromat, a kind of proof that he had truly escaped, truly become someone. He fell hard and Sloane fell too, because whatever else can be said of Callum Rourke, he was easy to love, warm and funny, and hungry in a way the soft rich boys around Sloane had never had to be. But loving Sloane meant entering the orbit of her mother. And Priscilla Whitfield had spent 30 years perfecting the art of deciding, with a single glance, who belonged in her world and who did not. The first dinner at the Whitfield estate was a quiet interrogation dressed as hospitality. Crystal candlelight, 4 forks. Callum had to guess his way through. Priscilla smiled the whole time and asked her questions like a woman laying tiles. "And your people, Callum, where are they from? And what does your mother do?" He said, "She's in textiles," which was almost true and entirely a lie, and he hated himself a little for the smoothness with which it left his mouth. Priscilla's smile did not change, but something behind her eyes filed the answer away. She was herself a woman with a great deal to hide, though Callum could not have known it then. A woman who had built her whole gleaming life on the terror of being found out. And people like that develop a nose for the very thing they fear. She looked at Callum Rourke in his good suit that was one season out of fashion, and she smelled Millhaven on him. From that night forward, though she never said it aloud, Priscilla Whitfield set about the quiet work of keeping her daughter's wedding free of the wrong sort of people. When the engagement was announced, Odessa wept for joy in her little rooms and set about making a gift. She could not buy Sloane a car or a house or a honeymoon in Italy, but she could give the only thing she had ever had to give, her hands. For 3 weeks she worked on a wedding quilt, ivory and pale blue, every stitch set by candlelight, a border of climbing roses she designed herself. Into one corner she embroidered, so small you had to know to look for it, C&S and the date. It was, without exaggeration, the finest thing she had ever made. She wrapped it in brown paper and mailed it to the estate. And Priscilla Whitfield opened it in her marble kitchen, held it up between 2 fingers as though it might carry something, and laughed. A light, genuine, devastating laugh. "How rustic," she said, and folded it away into a closet where no one would ever see it. Callum was standing right there. He watched his mother's 3 weeks of love disappear behind a closet door. And Callum Rourke said nothing at all. That silence, his silence, not hers, was the true beginning of the end. Because a man who will not defend his mother's quilt will, soon enough, fail to defend his mother. The wedding plans grew grand and grander, and with each meeting at the estate, Callum let himself be shaped a little more into the man the Whitfields wanted him to be. Odessa's name came up less and less. When she called to ask, shyly, what she might wear, what she might help with, whether there was a rehearsal dinner she should know about, his answers grew shorter, vaguer, kinder in tone and colder in fact. He was not a monster. That is the hardest part of this story, my child. He was not a monster. He was only a frightened boy in a rich man's suit, terrified that the world would look at his mother and, through her, finally see the truth of him. And so, one afternoon 6 weeks before the wedding, he drove to Millhaven to have a conversation he would regret for the rest of his life. He came on a Sunday, in a car that did not belong on Sycamore Street. Odessa saw it from her window and hurried to put the kettle on, smoothing her hair, her heart lifting the way it always lifted when her boy came home. She had bought his favorite cookies. She had pressed a clean cloth onto the little table. When he climbed the narrow stairs and ducked through her low doorway, she took his face in both her hands the way she had since he was small, and she said, "Look at you. Look how handsome." Callum smiled, but the smile did not reach his eyes, and Odessa, who had spent a lifetime reading the true weather behind her son's face, felt the first cold drop of something she could not yet name. She poured the tea. She slid the cookies toward him. She asked about Sloane, about the wedding, about the flowers, chattering happily to fill a silence that was growing in the room like a shadow at evening. And Callum turned his cup around and around on its saucer and could not seem to begin. "Mom," he said finally. "The wedding." I need to talk to you about the wedding. She folded her hands and waited, still smiling, still hoping it was about a dress, a dance, a task he needed done. He said the Whitfields were particular people. He said it was a certain kind of event, with certain kinds of guests. His colleagues, Sloane's family's friends, people from a world with rules Odessa wouldn't be familiar with. He said the word optics, which she did not know, and the word expectations, which she did. He talked in circles, the way a man does when he is trying to say a cruel thing without having to hear himself say it. And Odessa sat very still and let him circle, because some part of her already understood where the circling would land, and she wanted, God help her, to give him every chance to turn back before he got there. But he did not turn back. He had rehearsed this in the car. He lowered his voice, and he reached the center of the thing. I think, he said, it would be better if you didn't sit at the family table. Maybe not up front at all. He would not meet her eyes. It's just, the way Priscilla's arranged everything, the people you'd be next to, it would be uncomfortable. For you. You'd feel out of place. Your dress, you don't have the kind of things those people have, and they'd see it, and I don't want them looking at you like that. I'm trying to protect you. He believed it even. That was the terrible genius of shame. It had taught him to call it protection. There'll be a spot in the back where you can watch everything. You won't have to talk to anyone. Please, Mum. Just this once. Just don't make it a thing. He finally looked up. And what he saw in his mother's face was not anger, which he could have argued with, and not tears, which he could have soothed. He saw understanding. She understood him completely. And that was worse than any accusation she could have made. Odessa did not raise her voice. She had learned 30 years earlier over a pot of burning oatmeal exactly how much silence a person can hold. She looked at her son, this beautiful frightened man she had built out of her own body and her own bleeding hands, and she said only, "All right." 2 words. She said them gently, so he would not have to carry guilt he was too weak to carry. "All right, Callum. I'll sit wherever you need me to sit." He exhaled as though a stone had been lifted from his chest, and he thanked her, and he did not notice, because shame makes a man blind as well as cruel, that his mother's hands, folded in her lap, had begun to tremble. He stayed 20 more minutes. He praised the cookies he did not eat. Then he drove back to the world that had taught him to be ashamed of her, and Odessa sat alone at her little table until the tea went cold and the light went gray, holding herself very still, the way you hold a cracked cup you are not ready to admit is broken. What Callum did not know, what he would not learn for 6 long weeks, was that the seating chart he blamed on Priscilla had, in fact, been Priscilla's design from the start. She had studied him, and studied the mother she had never met, and she had decided that the cleanest wedding was one in which the Rourke's true origins never breathed the same air as her guests. She had planted the idea in Callum's mind so gently he believed he'd thought of it himself. But there was one person in the Whitfield house that autumn who was beginning to feel the whole thing curdle. Sloane. She had found the ivory quilt in the closet. She had unfolded it and traced the tiny embroidered roses, and found the initials hidden in the corner, C and S, and she had stood in that dim hallway holding 3 weeks of a stranger's love, and something in her had gone quiet and cold. She said nothing to her mother. She said nothing to Callum. But Sloane Whitfield began very quietly to watch. You see, the cruelest silences are not the ones we are forced into. They are the ones we choose to protect the very people who are hurting us. In the weeks that followed, Odessa did what she had always done with pain. She worked. Her friend Marguerite, who had run the laundromat downstairs for 20 years and knew every secret on Sycamore Street, was not so quiet about it. "You raised that boy on your knees," Marguerite said one evening, jabbing the air with a folded towel. "On your knees, Odessa, scrubbing rich men's floors. And now he tells you to sit in the back like the help. You call him. You tell him the truth. You tell him everything you did." And Odessa, sorting buttons at the counter, only shook her head. "If I have to tell him," she said, "then it was never really a gift. It was a loan. And I never once in 30 years let that boy believe he owed me anything." Marguerite threw up her hands. But Odessa meant it with her whole soul. She had given her son his pride the way you give a child a coat, so he could go out into the cold and never feel it. She would not now tear the coat off his back just because the cold had finally reached her instead. And yet she would go. That was the line Odessa drew, the one small country of herself she refused to surrender. She would sit in the back, yes, she would speak to no one, she would cause no scene. But she would not hide in Millhaven and let her only child be married with an empty chair where his mother should be. "A woman can be humble," she told Marguerite, "without disappearing." So she bought 3 yards of navy fabric with money she'd set aside, and she began to make herself a dress. Not a poor woman's dress, not a rich woman's dress, but her dress, cut clean and simple and true, the work of a master who had spent 40 years learning exactly how cloth wants to fall. She worked on it 11 nights. And as her needle rose and fell in the lamplight, the same lamplight she had sewn beneath when Callum was a baby sleeping in the next room, Odessa made her peace. She would go to her son's wedding with her back straight and her hands clean. Whatever they thought of her dress, no one alive could say she had not earned the right to wear it. Now the truth about Priscilla Whitfield, which not even Gerald fully knew. She had not been born to marble kitchens. 40 years before, in a mill town not 2 hours from Millhaven, she had been Priscilla Dunn, the daughter of a man who drank and a mother who cleaned motel rooms, and she had waited tables at a highway diner in a brown polyester uniform that smelled of fryer grease. She had clawed her way out one careful step at a time. A better job, a better dress, a better accent practiced in a mirror, and finally Gerald Whitfield, 12 years older and dazzled, who never thought to ask too many questions about where his lovely young wife had come from. Priscilla had spent every day since terrified that someone would look at her and see the diner, the grease, the girl. And that is why she could not bear Odessa Rourke. It was not that Odessa was beneath her. It was that Odessa was honest about being poor, wore it without shame, without hiding, and Priscilla could not forgive her that, because it was the one thing Priscilla had never dared to do. Sloane, meanwhile, could not let it rest. The quilt had unsettled something in her that would not settle again. So one gray afternoon, telling no one, she drove the hour to Millhaven with the address from an old form in Callum's files. She found Sycamore Street. She found the laundromat, the faded sign in the window. Rourke Alterations, nothing too small, the 2 dark windows above it. She sat in her expensive car at the curb with the engine ticking and looked up at the little rooms where the man she loved had been made into a man. She thought about the closet at home, and the roses stitched by candlelight, and the mother she had never been allowed to meet. She almost got out. Her hand was on the door. Then a woman appeared in the upstairs window, small, gray-haired, holding something up to the fading light and squinting at it, a needle glinting in her fingers, and Sloane lost her nerve entirely. She did not know what she would say. She only knew, driving home in the dark, that she was about to marry into a lie, and that the lie was not the mother's. It was her own family's. And it was Callum's. That same evening, 60 miles away, Odessa took down the shoebox. She sat on her bed and lifted the lid and breathed in leather and sawdust and 15 years of a life she had kept in the dark. She took out the letter, Silas Crane's letter, on the firm's heavy cream paper, the promise of his silence, the proof of everything she had done. She read it once, slowly, her lips moving over the old words. And then she folded it 3 times and put it back. She would not bring it to the wedding. She would not lay it on the table like a winning card. To use it would be to undo the whole meaning of her life, to make her love into a receipt, her sacrifice into a weapon. Well, let them think what they thought. She would sit in the back with her secret intact, and she would carry to her grave the truth of what she had spent to raise the man they were ashamed of. She closed the box. She had no way of knowing that another person, an old man with shaking hands, had kept the very same secret all these years, and that he had just received an invitation to a wedding. The wedding day came bright and golden, and Hawthorne Estate had never looked finer. Priscilla had spent a fortune, and it showed in every petal. 200 chairs in neat white rows. A willow strung with lights not yet lit. Waiters gliding with trays of champagne through a garden that smelled of roses and money. Callum stood at the arch in his charcoal suit, checking his cuffs for the 10th time, and when he saw who was walking up the path toward him, his heart nearly stopped. Silas Crane, the founder. The legend himself, 80 now and moving slowly on a silver cane, had accepted the Whitfields' invitation. An invitation Priscilla had sent purely for the shine of his name, never dreaming the old man had any reason to come. Callum hurried to greet him, flushed with pride. To be married in front of Silas Crane. It was the final proof, the capstone of everything he had built. "Sir," he said, "I can't believe you came." And Silas Crane looked at the beaming young architect he had hired years ago and said quietly, "I wouldn't have missed it, son. Not for anything." Callum did not hear the strange weight in the old man's voice. Odessa arrived the way she had come to everything her whole life, early, quietly, and alone. She had taken 2 buses and walked the last half-mile up the estate's long drive in her navy dress and her polished shoes, and she stood at the edge of all that gold light with her brown handbag held in both hands. She had prepared herself. She had promised herself she would not cry. And when Callum crossed the lawn and told her, in that low, almost tender voice, that there had been a change with the seating, she only nodded, exactly as she had promised him she would. Followed the kind young caterer to the folding chair behind the dessert table. She sat. She smoothed her skirt. From there, half hidden by a linen curtain, she could see the arch where her son would marry, and she fixed her eyes on it and told herself that this was enough, that to watch him be happy was enough, that a mother's love does not require a good seat. She believed it mostly. She almost believed it all the way. But Silas Crane, from his place of honor at the head table, had stopped believing anything the Whitfields wanted him to believe. He had noticed the woman the moment she arrived. The straight back, the handmade dress, the careful dignity of the very poor in a very rich place. Something about her had reached across 15 years and taken hold of him. And when he saw the young architect walk to her and whisper, and saw her nod and follow a caterer to a folding chair behind the desserts, the last piece fell into place, and the old man's breath left him. He knew that walk. He knew that stubborn straightness of spine. He had waited by an elevator for that woman on 100 winter nights, had shaken her calloused hand, had signed a letter promising to keep her secret until he died. Ursa, Callum's mother, the cleaning woman. The whole hidden architecture of the young man's life stood suddenly revealed to Silas Crane, and with it the meaning of the folding chair, and the old man felt something rise in his chest that he had not felt in a very long time. It was rage. Then Priscilla stood to welcome her guests. Radiant, triumphant, a queen in her garden. She lifted a glass and thanked everyone for coming to celebrate, 2 families joining as one. She spoke of standards, of legacy, of surrounding ourselves only with the very best people. And then, with a light laugh, meaning it as a charming aside, she said, "You know, I always say, everyone looks lovely when they know their proper place." A ripple of polite laughter moved through the garden. It was nothing to them. A hostess's little joke. But Silas Crane heard it land, and he saw, behind the dessert table, the small gray-haired woman lower her eyes to her lap. And he understood that Priscilla Whitfield had just made a joke, in front of 200 people, at the expense of a woman who had scrubbed marble floors on her knees after midnight so that her son could stand at that very arch. The old man's hand tightened on his cane. Something in him that had stayed politely seated for 80 years decided, all at once, that it would sit no longer. Slowly, deliberately, Silas Crane set down his glass. The gesture was small, but he was Silas Crane, and when a legend moves, a room feels it. Conversations faltered at the nearest tables. Heads turned. Priscilla, still standing with her champagne raised, saw the guest of honor rise unsteadily to his feet and assumed, with a flush of pleasure, that the great man wished to offer a toast to the happy couple. What an honor, what a coup, exactly the moment she had dreamed of when she sent the invitation. She beamed at him. "Mr. Crane," she said warmly, gesturing for quiet. "Please. We would be so honored." The garden hushed. 200 faces turned toward the old architect leaning on his silver cane. Callum at the arch smiled with helpless pride. And Odessa, behind the dessert table, looked up at last, and across all that gold light, her eyes met the eyes of the one man in the world who knew exactly who she was. Some truths wait years for the right room, and then they stand up. Silas Crane did not raise a glass. He let the silence stretch until it filled every corner of the garden, and then, in a voice worn thin by age but still carrying the authority of a man who had shaped skylines, he began to speak. "Thank you, Priscilla," he said. "But I'm afraid I haven't come to give a toast. I've come to tell a story. I'm an old man, and old men are permitted their stories, and this one I have kept to myself for 15 years. Too long, I think. Far too long." A few guests exchanged amused glances, settling in for what they assumed would be a charming ramble from the guest of honor. Priscilla's smile stayed fixed in place, though the first small flicker of unease had entered her eyes. Callum at the arch felt an odd coolness pass over him, the way you feel a cloud cross the sun before you look up to find it. And Silas Crane leaned on his silver cane, and looked out over the sea of pale suits and jeweled ears and said, "Years ago in my firm, there was a woman who cleaned our floors at night." Behind the dessert table, Odessa went cold. She knew, before he said another word, exactly where the old man was going, and everything in her rose up to stop him. This was the thing she had guarded for 15 years, the one secret she had sworn to carry to her grave. She caught his eye across the garden and gave the smallest shake of her head, a plea, a whole silent argument in a single motion. "Please, don't. Let him keep his pride. Let me keep my silence." Silas Crane saw it. He paused. For one long moment the two of them held each other's gaze across all that gold light, an old man and an old woman bound by a promise no one else in the world knew existed. And then, gently, almost tenderly, Silas Crane looked away from her and continued speaking, because he had decided that there are some silences that protect the wrong people, and that a mother's love, kept too well hidden, can be stolen by the very ones who owe it everything. He would break his promise. He would beg her forgiveness later. But he would not let this stand. "She cleaned our floors for years," Silas went on, "and not one of us knew her name. She emptied our wastebaskets and dusted our models and went home before dawn, and we walked past her every night as though she were furniture. Until one morning I came in early and found a drawing on a drafting table. A tower, turning as it rose like water, like something alive. Drawn in cheap pencil by a hand I didn't recognize." Around the garden, the amused smiles had begun to fade into genuine attention. There was something in the old man's voice now that did not belong to a wedding toast. "I stayed late that night to find out who had made it. And I discovered it was not one of my architects at all. It was a boy, 16 years old, the son of the woman who cleaned our floors, A boy who waited for his mother in our lobby at night because she couldn't afford anyone to watch him. At the arch, Callum Rourke had gone very still. A drafting table. A twisting tower. A winter night in a lobby. His own memory rose up to meet the old man's words, and his face began slowly to lose its color. "I offered to help that boy," Silas said. "A scholarship. An education. Every door I could open, I opened. And do you know what his mother asked me in return? Not money. Not thanks. She asked me to promise the boy would never find out. She said, and I have remembered her exact words for 15 years, she said, a boy who believes he owes his whole life to his mother's knees will spend that life ashamed. Let him think he earned it himself." The garden had gone utterly silent now. So I kept her secret. That boy grew up believing he had made himself, all alone out of nothing. He became a fine architect, the finest young man at my firm. Silas Crane turned at last and looked directly at the arch. He is standing right there, in the charcoal suit, about to be married. 200 heads turned toward Callum. And then, as understanding rolled through the crowd like a wave, those same 200 heads turned slowly, terribly, toward the small gray-haired woman sitting alone on a folding chair behind the dessert table. "That woman," said Silas Crane, and he lifted one shaking hand and pointed, so there could be no mistake. "The one you seated behind the desserts, the one you were told did not belong at your fine tables, scrubbed marble floors on her knees after midnight for 11 years so that the groom at this wedding could stand where he stands today. She is Odessa Rourke. She is Callum's mother. And there is not a soul in this garden, myself included, who has earned the right to seat her anywhere but at the head of it." The silence that followed was the loudest thing Odessa had ever heard. She sat frozen, her hands gripping her brown handbag, 200 strangers staring at her, the secret of her whole life torn open in the September sun. And at the arch, Callum Rourke looked at his mother, really looked at her for the first time in years, and the color drained entirely from his face as the meaning of the folding chair, and the quilt, and the 2 small rooms above the laundromat, and 30 years of a love he had been ashamed of, crashed over him all at once. For a moment no one moved. Then Callum Rourke stepped away from the arch. He walked out from under the flowers and the lights, past the 200 staring guests, past Priscilla frozen with her champagne still raised, past the willow and the string quartet, and he crossed the whole length of that golden garden toward the folding chair behind the dessert table. Each step seemed to cost him something. His polished shoes, which made no sound, carried him back across every year he had spent walking away. When he reached her, he stopped. He looked down at his mother, at the navy dress she had sewn over 11 nights, at the calloused hands he had never once let himself think about, at the face he had told to sit in the back so that finer people would not have to see it. And Callum Rourke, junior partner, self-made man, groom in a charcoal suit, opened his mouth to speak and found that he could not. His whole life had been a house built on a lie he never knew he was telling. And now, in front of everyone, the house came down. He sank down before her, not gracefully, not for show, but the way a man sinks when his legs simply stop holding him, until he was kneeling on the grass at his mother's feet, exactly where the truth had always said he belonged. "Mom!" His voice broke on the single syllable. "Mom, I'm sorry. I didn't know. All those years I thought." He could not finish. Tears he had no right to were running down his face. "The scholarship, interview, all of it was you. Was always you. And I told you to sit in the back." Odessa looked at her son kneeling in the grass in his beautiful suit, and she did not gloat, and she did not weep, and she did not say any of the 10,000 things she had earned the right to say. She reached out one worn hand and laid it against his cheek, the way she had when he was small and frightened, and she said only, so quietly that the nearest guests had to strain to hear it, "I never wanted you to know, my boy. I only ever wanted you to walk tall. And that broke him more completely than any anger ever could have. Priscilla Whitfield was still standing, still holding her glass, and she made one last attempt to save the afternoon she had built. Well, she said with a brittle little laugh, this is all very touching, but really we do have a ceremony too. Sit down, Priscilla. It was Silas Crane, quiet and iron. I've known a great many people who came up from nothing. The finest people I ever met came up from nothing. The only shame in it belongs to those who spend their lives pretending they didn't. He let the words settle, and he looked at Priscilla in a way that made her understand with sudden horror that this old man saw straight through her, through the practiced accent, through the marble kitchen, all the way down to a brown polyester uniform in a highway diner 40 years gone. Her glass trembled in her hand. For the first time in 3 decades, Priscilla Whitfield felt the floor of her invented life shift beneath her, and she sat down slowly, silently, her triumph turning to ash in her mouth as 200 guests watched the queen of the garden come quietly undone. Then Sloane moved. She had been standing near the arch in her white gown, and now she walked, not toward Callum but past him, to a bag she had left beneath the head table. And from it she drew something ivory and pale blue, folded soft, and she carried it across the garden and shook it open in the sunlight for everyone to see. The wedding quilt. The climbing roses. The tiny initials in the corner. You made this, Sloane said to Odessa, her own eyes shining. 3 weeks by hand. I found it in a closet where it had been hidden, and I've kept it ever since, because I couldn't bear that no one had thanked you. She turned to face her mother, and her voice did not shake. I found the quilt, Mother. I found Sycamore Street. I know where Callum comes from, and I know where you come from too because I looked. I'm not ashamed of any of it. The only thing at this wedding I'm ashamed of is the seating chart. Priscilla opened her mouth and closed it again. There was nothing left in her to say. Her own daughter had chosen the woman behind the dessert table. Odessa rose then, at last, from the folding chair. She stood in her navy dress with her back straight and her hands clean, and she looked at Priscilla Whitfield. Not with triumph, not with hatred, but with something far more devastating. Recognition. You and I, Odessa said gently. We are more alike than you would ever want to be told. I know what it is to be afraid of where you come from. I just made a different peace with it than you did. Priscilla's carefully composed face crumpled at that, because it was true, and because kindness from the very woman she had wronged was more than her pride could bear. I forgive you, Odessa went on quietly to the whole silent garden. All of you. Life is too short and too hard to carry this to my grave. Then she turned to her son, still kneeling in the grass, and she helped him to his feet with hands that had earned the right to lift him. Now stand up, Callum, she said. You have a wife to marry. And this time, your mother will be watching from the front. They married her son that afternoon after all, but everything about it had changed. Callum would not begin the ceremony until his mother had been moved. He walked her himself, arm in arm, from the folding chair behind the desserts to the very first row, to the chair that should have been hers all along, and he seated her there in her navy dress in full view of 200 people who now knew exactly who she was and exactly what she had done. When he took his place beneath the arch again and turned to watch Sloane come down the aisle, his eyes went first and last to his mother. The vows were spoken. The rings were exchanged. And when the officiant pronounced them husband and wife, Callum Rourke did not kiss his bride first. He crossed to the front row and he bent and he kissed his mother's forehead, the way she had kissed his 10,000 times in 2 small rooms above a laundromat, and the whole garden, even the finest and coldest among them, rose to their feet and wept. The months that followed rearranged a great many things. Callum was not the same man. You cannot kneel in the grass and watch your whole life turn over and stand up unchanged. He came to Millhaven often now, and not at Christmas only. Every few weeks, with Sloane, climbing the narrow stairs to sit at the little table and drink his mother's tea and eat the cookies he had once been too ashamed to finish. Sloane loved Odessa easily and completely, the way you love someone you have been waiting your whole life to meet. And Priscilla was quieter now. The garden had seen through her, and something in her had let go of the exhausting work of pretending. She never became warm exactly. But one afternoon she drove to Sycamore Street alone, and sat at Odessa's little table, and the two women who had both come up from nothing spoke for the first time as equals. Whatever passed between them stayed between them. But Priscilla left with the ivory quilt folded in her arms, to keep on her own bed, where she would see it every morning and remember. Callum wanted to give his mother everything, a house, an easier life, all the money he had. But Odessa would not take it, and here is the thing you must understand about her. It was not pride that made her refuse. It was that she had never done any of it to be repaid. "I don't want your money, my boy," she told him. "I want my son. I have missed him for years." So Callum gave her the only thing that would do. He hung the crayon drawing, "The Too Many Windowed Building, My Dad Built This," in shaky letters, on the wall of his glass office overlooking the river, framed in gold where every client and colleague could see it. When they asked, he told them the truth. All of it. He had spent years hiding where he came from. Now he could not stop speaking of it. And the twisting tower, the one he had drawn at 16 on a winter night in a borrowed lobby. Crane and Vale built it at last, downtown, 40 stories reaching into the sky. Callum named it the Odessa. His mother's name on the skyline, for as long as the city stands. Silas Crane became Odessa's friend in the last years of his life. He would send a car. She scolded him for the extravagance every single time, and the two of them would sit on her small balcony above the laundromat, an old architect and an old seamstress, and talk about nothing and everything until the light went down over the coffee-colored river. He told her more than once that breaking his promise at that wedding was the finest thing he had ever done. She never quite agreed, but she never quite argued either. And on her closet shelf behind the winter blankets, the old shoebox sat where it had always sat, smelling of leather and sawdust. But its secret had gone out into the light now, and lived there safely, and the letter inside was no longer a thing to be feared. Odessa added one photograph to the box, taken that September afternoon. A small gray-haired woman in a navy dress, seated in the very front row, and beside her a son on his knees in the grass, holding her hand as though he would never again let it go. They married her son that afternoon after all, but everything about it had changed. Callum would not begin the ceremony until his mother had been moved. He walked her himself, arm in arm, from the folding chair behind the desserts to the very first row, to the chair that should have been hers all along, and he seated her there in her navy dress in full view of 200 people who now knew exactly who she was and exactly what she had done. When he took his place beneath the arch again and turned to watch Sloane come down the aisle, his eyes went first and last to his mother. The vows were spoken. The rings were exchanged. And when the officiant pronounced them husband and wife, Callum Rourke did not kiss his bride first. He crossed to the front row and he bent and he kissed his mother's forehead, the way she had kissed his 10,000 times in 2 small rooms above a laundromat, and the whole garden, even the finest and coldest among them, rose to their feet and wept. The months that followed rearranged a great many things. Callum was not the same man. You cannot kneel in the grass and watch your whole life turn over and stand up unchanged. He came to Millhaven often now, and not at Christmas only. Every few weeks, with Sloane, climbing the narrow stairs to sit at the little table and drink his mother's tea and eat the cookies he had once been too ashamed to finish. Sloane loved Odessa easily and completely, The way you love someone you have been waiting your whole life to meet. And Priscilla was quieter now. The garden had seen through her, and something in her had let go of the exhausting work of pretending. She never became warm exactly. But one afternoon she drove to Sycamore Street alone, and sat at Odessa's little table, and the two women who had both come up from nothing spoke for the first time as equals. Whatever passed between them stayed between them. But Priscilla left with the ivory quilt folded in her arms, to keep on her own bed, where she would see it every morning and remember. And that, my children, is the story of the woman they said was too poor to sit at her own son's wedding. You see, I have lived long enough to know the truth of it. The world is very quick to measure a person by the chair they are given. But the chair tells you nothing. The chair only tells you who was doing the measuring. Odessa Rourke sat on a folding chair behind a table of desserts, and she was, in that moment, the wealthiest soul in a garden full of millionaires, because she carried inside her a love so large she had spent 30 years hiding it so it would not weigh her boy down. That is a thing money cannot buy and shame cannot touch. My child, if the world ever seats you in the back and tells you that you do not belong, sit up straight, fold your hands, and keep your dignity the way Odessa kept hers. For the truth has a way of standing up on its own 2 feet when you least expect it. And when it does, it always walks to the front. Now come closer. Let Grandma tell you another.